The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Welcome to Wonderfully Made. In today's segment of Wonderfully Made, we will be considering a very important and interesting subject, the concepts of preventive medicine. I am Dr. Meshach Samuel, and I currently serve as a family practitioner, and I enjoy doing what I do in the field of primary care. Preventive medicine is my favorite topic. I believe that the correct understanding of this subject is important for each one of us. I have noticed that many today are seeing the devastating effects of chronic disease and are showing more and more interest in preventive medicine. I hope that today's presentation will help us get a better understanding of the true meaning and importance of preventive medicine. Let's start with this statement. Successful prevention depends upon knowledge of causation. In other words, if we know what is causing a particular problem, it will be easier to prevent it from developing. Let's start with a basic question. What causes disease? During the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, a simple model was strongly promoted. It involved a single factor. It was said that an agent affects man and causes the disease. Most often, this single factor was an infectious agent, and therefore it was called the germ theory of disease. And this theory gained acceptance mainly because of the rapid spread of infectious diseases during those years. Millions died of diseases such as malaria, polio, typhoid, smallpox, and so on. When the disease agent was identified and eliminated, the disease was arrested or prevented. As a result of advances in public health, improved sanitation, and appropriate use of antibiotics, infectious diseases began to decline, but only to be replaced by a new type of diseases, the so-called modern diseases of civilization, also referred to as diseases of lifestyle, such as lung cancer, coronary heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and so on. Now, these diseases could not be explained on the basis of a single factor causation, nor could they be prevented by the traditional methods of isolation or immunization or improvement in sanitation. It is now recognized that many of the chronic diseases that we struggle with today are rarely caused by a single agent alone, but instead, it depends upon a number of factors which contribute to its development. This is referred to as multiple factor causation, as opposed to the single factor causation that we talked about. Attempts have been made to group these multiple factors into different categories. One such example is the agent, environment, and host triad. A stable balance or an equilibrium seems to exist between man and his environment, resulting in a disease-free state. But when there is a negative interaction between these groups, disease results. Let us look at some of the examples of factors in each of these three categories. The first one, agent factors. It is easy for us to understand agents such as bacteria, viruses, yeasts, and parasites. These are examples of biological agents that could cause disease. And all of these act as infectious agents. Then we have chemical agents such as poisonous gases, insecticides, fertilizers, and so on. We know of factors such as excessive heat, excessive cold, radiation, and electricity that could act as agents of diseases too. These are physical agents. And then, of course, we have nutritional or dietary factors that could become an agent of disease. The deficiency of some substances in our diet or the excess of it can cause diseases too. For example, low iron in the blood could cause anemia. We know that too much cholesterol or fat in our diet causes serious disease conditions. Now let us see some examples in the second category, that will be environmental factors. Many of the factors that we see or saw in the previous category of agents are really a part of the environment, such as heat, cold, dust, and so on. Environmental factors really include all of man's external surroundings, such as air, water, housing, sanitation, and so on. Any or all of these factors could play a role in the causation of disease. Now let's move on to the third category, that is the host. Factors such as age, sex, and ethnic group do play a role in some disease conditions. And then we have some subtle factors such as social isolation. I see how this affects many of my patients, especially the elderly who are locked in most of the time. Then we see children experiencing maternal deprivation and broken families. These things are beginning to emerge as important factors for causation of disease. However, in speaking of prevention of chronic diseases, the most important are those that are lifestyle related. Lack of physical exercise, use of alcohol, drugs, and tobacco, unhealthy habits such as poor sleeping patterns and stress. These lifestyle related factors have become so important that today man, that is the host, is viewed as an agent of his own diseases. In other words, man's state of health is determined more by what he does to himself than what some outside agent does to him. For example, the medical cause of lung cancer may be a chemical substance in the cigarette. But this agent does not really affect man until man decides to cultivate tobacco plants, harvest the leaves, process it to obtain the right concentration of nicotine, then roll it in paper in the form of cigarettes, places one end between his lips, burns the other end with fire, and inhales the smoke into his lungs. So although the medical cause may be the nicotine and other cancer-causing substances in the cigarette, the real cause of the disease is man's choice or his behavior, which is smoking. We call this the psychosocial cause of disease. So we see that chronic diseases of today are largely lifestyle related, and they result from multiple factors. And not only multiple factors, but from complicated interactions of these multiple factors. The purpose of studying these factors is to see if we can modify them or remove them in an attempt to prevent or control disease. We have been talking about the causation of disease. Let us now consider an important element in preventive medicine, and that is the natural history of disease. What do we mean by natural history of disease? It simply refers to the way in which a disease evolves over time, from the earliest stages of its involvement to its termination as either recovery or disability or death. Let us see if we can illustrate this with a diagram. Let's say that the horizontal line that you see on your screen represents a timeline, a period in one's life. Let us now place a short vertical line somewhere along this timeline to represent the point of onset of the disease in this particular individual. Now we have the time period divided in two. The period beyond the point of intersection represents the disease phase or pathogenesis phase. Pathogenesis may be a new word to some of us. We know that genesis means beginning, and pathos is a Greek word which literally means suffering. And if you can correlate suffering with disease, the term literally translates the beginning of the disease phase. Now, and the timeline before the intersection to represent the disease-free state or pre-pathogenesis phase. Now let us take a closer look at the pathogenesis phase or the disease phase. In most cases, whether it be an infectious disease or a chronic disease, that is lifestyle-related disease, there is a period soon after the onset when the disease agent is affecting the person, but there is no outward manifestation of the disease. In other words, there are no symptoms or physical signs. In the case of infectious diseases, this period is known as the incubation period. That is when the disease agent multiplies in the body without causing any symptoms or physical signs. If this is left unchecked, the agent begins to cause tissue damage and some physiological changes resulting in recognizable symptoms of the disease. In chronic diseases such as coronary heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, cancer, and so on, this period of time, that is soon after the onset of the disease, is less dramatic and often more prolonged and is referred to simply as the pre-symptomatic phase. And again, during this stage, there is no outward manifestation of the disease. And the sad thing about it is that in some instances, by the time signs and symptoms appear, the disease phase is already well advanced into the late pathogenesis phase. Now let us recall what we have discussed so far in our study today. Firstly, we said the cause of modern diseases is not only due to multiple factors, but also due to complicated interactions of these multiple factors. Next, we looked into the natural history of disease. That is, how the disease progresses in a person who is in the disease-free state to an early disease stage and then to the advanced or late stages. How does the knowledge of natural history of disease help us in our understanding or in our application of the principles of preventive medicine? Strictly speaking, the role of preventive medicine ends with the onset of the disease. However, some specialists in this field of medicine have suggested that we broaden the concept of preventive medicine. And when we do this, we set higher goals. Our primary goal would be to prevent the onset of the disease. But we don't stop there. We now set a secondary goal, which would be to prevent the progression of the disease. And then we go a step further with a tertiary goal, which would be to prevent the bad outcomes of the disease, which could be either impairments, disabilities, and sometimes even death. Now let's see if we can put all this in perspective. Let's take a look again at the diagram of the natural history of disease. We see the three periods: the disease-free period, the early disease period, and the late disease period. The first period is the disease-free period. Our goal here is to prevent the onset of the disease. This is our primary goal. And we can say that the actions taken during this period to prevent the onset of the disease is primary prevention. Now let's take a look at the next phase, the early disease period. The goal here is to prevent the progression of the disease. This is a secondary goal. We resort to this goal only if and when we have missed the primary goal of preventing the onset of the disease. The actions taken to achieve this goal can be called secondary prevention. Now let's move on to the third phase in the timeline of the natural history of disease. That is the advanced or the late disease phase. Here our goal is to prevent impairment or disability. This is our tertiary goal. We seek to attain this goal only when we have missed the primary and the secondary goals. And the way we attain this goal is by implementing tertiary prevention. So we now have 3 levels of prevention corresponding to the 3 major phases of the natural history of disease: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Now let's look into the 3 levels of prevention. We'll start with tertiary prevention. That is, efforts to prevent impairment and disability. Take, for example, someone who has suffered a stroke and is unable to walk or move an arm or unable to speak. An acute rehabilitation program with physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy often enables the person to regain a significant degree of their motor functions and be able to get back to independent living. This is quite an achievement. Yet, tertiary prevention is considered the least beneficial and least rewarding of the 3 levels of prevention because it involves intervention in the late stages of the disease, and much suffering and loss has already been experienced. That is why it is considered the weakest tool in preventive medicine. Now what about secondary prevention? This applies to interventions in the early stages of the disease period. What are the interventions at this stage? Early diagnosis and appropriate treatment. Secondary prevention helps prevent the progression of the disease. And in some instances, it enables one to even get back to the disease-free state. And this is certainly a desired goal in preventive medicine. Yet, secondary prevention is not the best tool in preventive medicine. We have seen earlier that tertiary prevention is the weakest tool. We can say that secondary prevention, although a very useful tool, is still an imperfect tool. Now that leads us to the quest for the perfect tool. And I'm sure you guessed it: primary prevention. We said that secondary prevention is an imperfect tool because it is more expensive and less effective than primary prevention. Primary prevention is action taken before the onset of the disease. Actions which remove the possibility that a disease will ever occur. What actions are taken in primary prevention? Everything that will preserve health and promote health. This is done by simply following the natural laws of health. It also includes specific protective measures. A good example of a protective measure in primary prevention is immunization or vaccination. For example, the flu vaccine. It is not recommended for everybody, but for a selective group of individuals who have a high risk of developing the disease. This is called specific protection because it protects against a specific problem. I'd like to call primary prevention the perfect tool, because primary prevention is far more than just averting the occurrence of a disease. It aims at promoting health. It aims at promoting well-being and improving the quality of life. It includes the concept of what may be called positive health. The Bible refers to this as abundant life. Now, I would like to use a story, or you could perhaps call it a parable, that would help us understand the importance or the value of primary prevention. It's more like a parable. There was once a village that was situated on top of a mountain. One side of the village, there was a forest that abruptly ended in a cliff. The villagers were a friendly, happy community that worked together and helped each other. But they soon realized that they were faced with a growing problem. Villagers who went into the forest to gather wood, or children who went into that part of the woods to play, would sometimes accidentally fall off the cliff and would be badly injured. And some even died because they could not get help in time. One day the village council met to discuss as to what could be done to solve this problem. Several suggestions were made. One suggested that some kind of an alarm system be set up to alert the people as soon as someone fell, so that help could be obtained without delay. But then they realized that there were times when all the able-bodied men were out in the fields working and no one was available to respond to an alarm. Someone else suggested that an emergency team be set up. People who could take turns to be on call to respond promptly. Yet another thoughtful person said, "It is difficult to climb down the hill, and it takes a while before the team gets there to offer the help." And it was said that whatever would really help is to construct a road to the foot of the mountain and have an ambulance ready that would get the team to the victim's aid quickly. Someone else said, the best way we can really take care of these unfortunate victims would be to set up an emergency unit at the foot of the mountain and have trained people and equipment ready and available whenever the need arises. I guess by now you figured where we are heading with this story or the parable. For finally, a little old man said, "Why don't we cut down a few trees from the forest and put up a fence along the cliff so that no one will fall?" And that is what they did, and no one was hurt after that. You will agree with me that all the earlier suggestions sound almost ridiculous when compared to the simple solution of putting up a fence. Prevention is definitely better than cure. This is a perfect example of the effectiveness and importance of primary prevention. But the question now arises, why then is so much importance given to secondary and tertiary care in conventional medicine today? There are many who criticize the medical system and the physicians of today for not placing the emphasis on primary prevention. Let me suggest a few thoughts for you to ponder over. It might help explain the reason why we are in the difficult situation that we find ourselves in. Firstly, in the parable, people are safe and well in the village until someone falls off the cliff. That is, there are time periods when everyone is safe and no one is hurt. Now in that situation, all the effort, all the manpower, and all the resources could be focused exclusively on building the fence. That is primary prevention. But the medical problem that faces us today does not fit that illustration. At any given time, there are thousands, in fact millions, fallen down the cliff and are in need of help. So while attempting to build a fence that is promoting primary prevention, it would be almost unethical to ignore the wounded and the dying. That is, to cut back on secondary and tertiary prevention. The second and even more important fact to consider is this. In the parable, the fence is a separate entity in and of itself. Whether people like it or not, it could be erected by those interested and concerned to bring about a change. But with modern diseases that plague us today, every individual has a direct role in putting up the fence. As we learned earlier, man is viewed as an agent of his own disease. We learned that our state of health is determined more by what we do to ourselves than what some outside agent does to us. So primary prevention in controlling modern diseases is not something that can be forced upon someone else. Primary prevention involves each individual's attitude towards life and health. It depends on the initiatives one takes about responsible measures to prevent diseases. I'd like to quote to you a passage from a favorite author of mine named Ellen G. White. She wrote these words more than 100 years ago. She states, "The people are perishing for want of knowledge. Disease of almost every description is pressing upon the people, yet they seem willing to remain in ignorance of the means of relief and the course to pursue to avoid disease." I believe that this is a perfect description of what we face in the medical field today. Primary prevention is certainly the perfect tool in preventive medicine. Building a fence is the most effective and meaningful way of going about this task. But it cannot be done by the physician alone or even by the best healthcare system in the world. It depends upon the individual's attitude towards life and health. And may I add that the best attitude towards health will come when we realize that we are created in the image of God, when we realize that we have been bought with an infinite price and that our bodies are the temple of the living God. I hope this presentation will create in us a desire to do our best to learn how to preserve, promote, and enjoy the abundant life that God has given to us as a gift. Thanks for joining me today in our study of the concepts of preventive medicine.